Well, thank you for joining us. We're very excited about this panel. My name is Lana. I'm an Indigenous Solidarity organizer and environmental justice organizer in Toronto, and I'll be moderating the talk tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, and likely other nations before that. The panel was a group effort among several organizations, including the Centre for Social Justice, East End Against Line 9, West End Against Line 9, Toronto 350, and Rising Tide Toronto. As you may have guessed, many of these groups have been engaged in the No Line 9 campaign over the last 3 years. And for those that aren't familiar, just a quick introduction, Line 9 is the local tar sands fracking pipeline that we've been fighting here. It would carry these products from Sarnia to Montreal, and there they would be shipped through the Montreal-Portland pipeline to Portland, Maine, and then out for export. So organizing against Line 9 has been our way of doing our part in stopping tar sands expansion. And the logic of pipeline resistance is that if we can stop new pipelines from going online, then it makes it very difficult for tar sands companies to put in new projects and export the product. And so as we've seen across the continent, people are organizing against pipelines, going in every direction, and this is something we've been doing here as well. And for most of us, the Line 9 campaign hasn't been not in my backyard kind of issue. Most of us have been organizing because of our desire to stop tar sands expansion. And you know, for us, the concerns are impacts on Indigenous communities, the impact on climate change in local environments, and so forth. But of course, there are local concerns as well, especially the fact that many of the First Nations communities along the pipeline haven't been consulted on the project as required by the Canadian Constitution. And in fact, we've been supporting a community called Chippewa-the-Thames First Nation, which has taken the issue to court and legally challenging the National Energy Board and the Canadian government for not consulting with the community that would be impacted. And of course, the pipeline is 90% likely to rupture. It would put at risk rivers and our drinking water, communities, very highly populated neighborhoods, and so forth. And I guess just to mention, it has been a few years, a 3-year campaign, and we have successfully delayed the project by at least a year, which is significant as well because this impacts investor confidence. And we've collectively, and this is groups in Toronto as well as other groups in southwestern Ontario and people in Quebec as well, collectively, have achieved this and cost the company some major money. But of course, at the core of what we are doing is based in our opposition to the tar sands, a project that benefits giant oil corporations at the expense of people, animals, ecosystems, and indeed the entire planet. So we're very happy to be jointly hosting this event, particularly in light of this recent debate sparked by Linda McQuaig's comments about the tar sands. Who here heard these comments in the ensuing debate? Okay, so quite a few people. For those that didn't hear about it, at the beginning of the federal election campaign, Linda McQuaig, who is the Toronto Centre MVP candidate, stated, and I quote, "A lot of people recognize that a lot of the oil sands oil may need to stay in the ground if we're going to meet our climate change targets." So this sparked a media backlash, even criticism within within her own party, accusations that she's ideologically driven, anti-Alberta, anti-jobs. So these are the things that we wanted to address today and set the facts straight. And so we've invited some of the biggest specialists on the tar sands to share information so that we can make our opinions based on solid information. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. First we have Andrew Nikiforuk. He is an award-winning investigative journalist who has been writing about the oil and gas industry, energy, and economics for more than 2 decades. Andrew's journalism has won 7 national magazine awards and top honors for investigative writing from the Association of Canadian Journalists. His book, Tar Sands, which criticized the pace and scale of the world's largest energy project, was a national bestseller and won the 2009 Rachel Carson Environment Book Award. And Andrew lives in Calgary, Alberta, so we're very lucky to have him here in town and on this panel today.
Thank you very much, Lana. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I think I argued back in 2008 that if Canada did not have a national debate about the pace and scale of development in the tar sands, then this country would be living a political emergency because of the power of the corporations involved in the project, as well as the stream of money going to Ottawa. And we are now living that emergency. And who would have, predicted that in 2008, that in desperation to find markets that really should not exist, so many pipelines would be proposed in this country and paraded around as though they were some kind of national development scheme. Pipelines don't develop anything. Pipelines extract materials. Bitumen should stay in the ground because it is a low quality, extremely low grade hydrocarbon. It was once light oil, and bacterial action over millions of years reduced it into this tarry sludge that is stuck to sand particles that have the sharpness and corrosiveness of diamonds. And it takes about 2 tons of sand to make 1 barrel of bitumen. And furthermore, it takes 1.3 barrels of bitumen to make 1 barrel of synthetic crude. And the reason for that is that we have to reverse geology. The product is so crappy and so badly biodegraded that we must pull the carbon molecules out and we must inject all kinds of hydrogen in order to enrich it to make a product called synthetic fuel. Bitumen should stay in the ground because really it is no longer economic at current low oil prices of $40 a barrel. And the money that we have put into the tar sands, which is now in excess of $200 billion, I mean, it is the world's largest energy project, really should have been invested in renewables, should have been invested in a transition. Bitumen should stay in the ground because of its paltry low energy returns. Cheap oil and light oil, more than 100 years ago, if you took 1 barrel and invested it in drilling in the ground, you could capture and produce and extract 100 barrels more. As the world's large oil fields have all been depleted over the last 100 years, it's becoming more and more difficult to get those huge energy surpluses. So currently, around the world, it takes about 1 barrel of oil or oil equivalent to extract another 20 barrels. That's not what's happening in the tar sands. In the mining projects, it takes 1 barrel of oil or oil equivalent, largely in the form of natural gas, to produce 4 or 5 barrels of oil. For the steam plants, where you are burning natural gas to boil water, to inject highly pressurized steam into the ground in order to melt bitumen, very deep deposits of bitumen, your energy returns are 1 to 2 or 1 to 1. A civilization no civilization can exist on energy returns that marginal. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the steam plants, which now produce 50% of the bitumen being produced in the tar sands, use 4 times more natural gas than the mining projects. And most of that natural gas is being fracked in shale basins underneath First Nations land in northern BC. And in the process of fracking these deep shales, enormous amounts of water are being used, and earthquakes, we're talking about thousands of earthquakes, have been caused throughout these geological formations in northern BC. Bitumen should stay in the ground because it is still the world's dirtiest hydrocarbon. Of 30 oils currently ranked by some of the world's best top energy researchers, extra heavy synthetic crude from Canada still produces the highest amount of greenhouse gases, 17% more than conventional oil. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the tar sands remains the largest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country, bar none. More than 12% of the nation's emissions are now coming from this project. By 2020, the emissions from this project will exceed all of the emissions from all passenger vehicle traffic. That's cars, that's trains, that's buses in Canada. And it is why we can meet, why we have failed to meet every target we have promised to meet. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the banks say it will soon become a stranded asset because of the growing demand for action on climate change around the world. They say, look, it's the world's most expensive oil, and it is therefore a very high-risk investment. And these banks, including the Deutsche Bank and including HSBC, which is my bank, and a bank, I might add, that has done a very good job of laundering cartel money in Mexico, among other fine achievements, says that these high-risk reserves will probably be unburnable. Furthermore, the HSBC adds that capital-intensive, high-cost projects such as the heavy oil sands are at the most risk under any scenario that deals with addressing climate change. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the agenda for its extraction has greatly undermined and threatened the democracy of Canada. Harper has muzzled scientists, climate change scientists, water scientists. The Harper government has attacked First Nations groups and accused them of being, foreign paid radicals. The government has systematically gutted all of Canada's oldest and finest environmental regulations, from the Fisheries Act to the Navigable Waters Act, all to ease the extraction and movement of bitumen in pipelines in this country. Bitumen should stay in the ground because North America and Europe are now consuming less oil. This is a whole new radical development that is taking place in the Western world as oil demand has begun to stagnate. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy concluded many years ago that expanding the tar sands and fighting climate change were not compatible. And so what happened? As a consequence, the Harper government shut down the roundtable, stopped funding it, said, well, we don't need this organization. And John Baird explained the abrupt closure of the roundtable, which was a very conservative group, I might add, saying that the Harper government shut it down because, quote, it should agree with the government. And I imagine the rest of that quote would be, and not with the science. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the production of roughly 3 million barrels of bitumen a year currently creates enough air pollution to slicken snowpacks within a 50-mile radius of the project with bitumen particles and heavy metals. And when that snow melts in the spring, an oil spill of nearly 15,000 barrels enters the Athabasca River and moves downstream towards the community of Fort Chip and into Lake Athabasca. And that happens every year. Bitumen should stay in the ground because no oil exporting nation has ever made a transition towards green energy. What are the leaders? The leaders in green energy all around the world are oil importing nations. They said, we've spent enough on oil. We cannot be a prisoner to this addiction. And therefore Germany has invested in green power. Therefore Denmark, an oil importing nation, has invested in green power. Spain, an oil importing nation, has invested in solar energy. China, an oil importing nation, has also invested in green energy. Bitumen should stay in the ground because the mines and the steam plants have now destroyed nearly 1 million hectares of boreal forest. That's an area 6 times larger than the city of New York, and in the process has nearly exterminated woodland caribou. I mean, all the predictions are that within the next 25 years, woodland caribou in the region will be gone. And if woodland caribou will be gone, what will remain of the culture of the Dene and the Métis and the Cree in that forest? Bitumen should stay in the ground because the revenue generated by this mega project, and the majority of it is going into federal coffers. 42% of all the revenue generated is going to federal coffers. Because it has not been saved for future generations. It has not been prudently managed. Harper has done the same thing that Margaret Thatcher did with oil revenues in England. He has spent them funding his political revolution. By 2020, industry will have generated $120 billion in royalties and taxes, and the majority of that, 42%, or approximately $51 billion, will have gone to the federal government, not Alberta. Bitumen should stay in the ground because we don't want to have this conversation with our grandchildren. And the conversation would go like this. Grandfather, did you do this? Do what? Did you frack rock in northern British Columbia and create thousands of earthquakes, some of them of magnitude as high as 4.8, to extract methane so that you could pipe this so-called cheap gas to Alberta to boil water to make steam and melt tar? Did you do that, grandfather? And the grandfather would have to say, yes, we did that. And then the grandchild would ask, and, well, did you use more natural gas to make hydrogen to help turn bitumen into synthetic crude so that North Americans could drive 4-ton vehicles for 5 kilometers to sports clubs to spend 15 minutes riding stationary bikes? And the answer to that question is, yes, we're doing that right now. That's not the conversation we want our grandchildren to have in this country. So, what should we do? And let me end here briefly. When you have to extract a resource as dirty and costly and high risk as bitumen, business as usual has ended for everything. For your economy, for your politics, and for the future in general. And for a resource with such incredibly poor energy returns. So there are a number of things I can encourage you to do. We need to pressure our politicians for a national carbon tax. Cap and trade won't do it. A national carbon tax will. We need to dramatically power down. We are all guilty of consuming too much energy because we live in an economy that encourages us to do that. That's what the economy is all about. It's all geared to get us to spend more energy. We need to make sure that we develop renewables in a different way than we have developed fossil fuels. We cannot turn our rural communities and our First Nations into sacrifice zones for green energy. High energy spending, and that's been our major problem. We have to replace it with low energy spending, and I just want, but the implications of that are entirely positive. That means instead of acting like consumers, if we spend less energy, then perhaps we will return again and reoccupy our roles as citizens. If we spend less energy, and we've spent so much craving speed and speeding up life, well, if we spend less, does that not mean that we will actually enjoy our lives and slow things down? We all know the perils of fast food. What's wrong with eating slowly and living slowly? Spending less energy means instead of being completely distracted by all of our high-spending digital gadgets, perhaps we will become more engaged, more connected, more present. Spending less energy perhaps means that instead of focusing on quantity, which is what the whole damn thing has all been about, that maybe now we can begin to focus on quality. So in the end, we don't need any more pipelines in this country, but we really do need a functioning rail service that can transport Canadians from one coast to another on trains running on hydropower. That would be a natural national project that our grandchildren would be proud of. And to do all this, I think we all need more hope. And St. Augustine put it best. He said, hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to change what needs to be changed. Thank you.